Okay, we're live.
Okay, and do we have everybody?
I see one staff member. Oh wait, there he is right there. No, he isn't. Where is he? I'm waiting for John Mann. And we do have a guest presenter that might be joining later, Steve Siegel. But we do have all of our commissioners. Would you like me to read through the list of the attendees for the minutes?
I think that would be helpful. Yeah, that might give John a chance to join.
Okay, so in no particular order from staff, Genevieve Scholl, President John Everett, Legal Counsel Anna Cavalieri, Budget Committee candidate Becca Sanders, Commissioner Ben Shepherd, Budget Committee candidate Chris Roebuck, Commissioner David Merriweather, from staff, Daryl Stafford, from staff, Fred Cowell, Commissioner Hobie Strike, Legal Counsel Jerry Jakes, Budget Committee member John Benton, Budget Committee member Judy Newman, from staff, Kevin Greenwood, Commissioner Christy Chapman, 2021 Commission candidate Locke Litford, and I apologize for pronouncing that probably very wrong. Budget Committee member Larry Brown, 2021 Port Commission candidate Mike Fox, Executive Director Michael McElway, Budget Committee member Svea Truax, and consultant Terry Moore.
Okay. And with that, I'll call us into session at 1:33. I'd like to welcome the commissioners, candidates for the commission, budget committee members. Thank you so much for your time, as always, and applicants. I'd note that Heather Gearing emailed me that she had to work today, so she won't be attending. But that's our list of attendees, and thanks all for coming. Yeah. Michael, can we start with the overview?
Yeah, you bet, President Everett. Welcome, everybody. I may be the only one that says this, but spring planning and fall planning are my favorite times of the year around the port, especially spring planning, because what you're going to take a look at here when you get to near the end of the agenda is essentially the first look at the early draft fiscal 22 budget. It'll come back to you with the budget in the budget committee context with more detail. But this is your first look at next fiscal year's budget outline, and within the context of a 10-year model. We're always looking ahead the near term, and we're always looking ahead 9 years after that to look at trends and, based on assumptions, see where the port is going from a fiscal basis with a whole lot of assumptions built into it. But what we try to do at this meeting, of course, is to identify some specific issues to bring to your attention or to remind the commission of that usually have an impact on the budget or budget thinking, but in some cases may not. So after the financial overview that Fred will give, we'll get at those key issues. There's 6 of them. And if you look at the time, approximate time on the right, there's 90 minutes. So obviously we don't have a ton of time, on average about 15 minutes per issue. So when we get to those key issues, we'll make a fairly brief staff presentations. You have the information in your packet, and mostly we want to point out why a specific issue is important, what the ramifications might be, and try to point the commission to what sort of feedback or discussion that we would recommend. And then, of course, it's up to the commission to take as long and go into as much detail as they want. What the financial planning model represents, as I said, is the first look at the fiscal 22 budget in context. This represents the culmination of a lot of staff work that started in December, really, and carried on through January and February and through March. And what Fred does is he takes all the different suggestions, requests, or have-tos from staff, and we consider those, and then we put them in context in this financial model. So a lot of work that led up to this, by individual staff, and then a ton of work by Fred in putting this together in this planning model that we've now used for over a decade. So I really enjoy these meetings, as the commission should weigh in on any one of these issues, ask questions, engage in whatever discussion that you think is appropriate, because that helps inform us to come back to you at the budget committee meeting in May with something that's more properly aligned with where the commission wants to go from a policy, capital planning, and a staffing standpoint. So I'm looking forward to it, and I really appreciate the attendance of not only the candidates but the budget committee members that are with us today. So thank you. With your permission, President Everett, I'll then transfer this to Fred.
Okay, Fred.
Okay, so in your packet, you'll see our three most key financial policies. And a lot of the board and some of the budget committee members have already seen this before. But for those that haven't, these policies are really bookends to make sure the port doesn't overspend itself and basically keep an eye on the revenue generation of the port over time. So one of the things any fiscal policy will have is, making sure you have adequate reserves. And this, can bounce back and forth, but at least the board has honed in on trying to maintain a set of reserves about 10% of your depreciable assets. So you always have something, you have a safety net. For one thing, having adequate reserves is one of the things whenever you issue debt that your lender will definitely look at. They'll look at your policies, but whether or not you have adequate reserves. And so that's part of one of the key integral pieces to our financial policy. The next one is really a bookend. It's called debt coverage ratio. And basically, anytime you go to any lender, they'll want to make sure you have adequate cash flow that will pay the debt and then some. So your revenue generation needs to cover all your expenses and your debt and then some. And so what we try to do here at the port is we try to maintain at least about a 2.0 debt coverage ratio. That means we have enough free cash flow to pay 2 times our debt that we have at any point in time. If you go out on the market today, you will at the very least, you'll have a coverage ratio of 1.35. You might get something lower, but that's a legal requirement. They want to see, any lender will want to see anything above that. They don't want you to get close to that legal requirement, because a legal requirement basically means you don't meet it, you're in default, and then other things start to occur. So to maintain that 2.0, what it does is it makes sure you don't spend as much money. You are controlling your expenditure over time, and you're keeping an eye on your revenue generation. So it does 2 things there, and it's really a good key fiscal policy to have. A third one there are others, but the third main one is really return on investment. And we always look at our cash on cash return before our debt service and capital outlay. And we always, it hovers around, it fluctuates anywhere between 2% all the way to 8% or more. And here, what you're trying to do is to make sure you're operating in a manner that you can reinvest your free cash flow, and it will in turn make money on top of that. So these 3 key components on our policy, fiscal policy, play an integral role and they're played out in this model that I'll show you at the end. But anyways, they're sort of guiding principles and policies that help us put together this forecast, and also help us make sure that we don't issue too much debt, we don't bring on too much staff, we don't overspend our budget. So anyways, Any questions?
Fred,
Yes.
could you just briefly point out where, when we have a reserve, what instruments that we generally deploy our reserves to? The state investment pool, what's the basic rate of return on that, and how we deployed it into some other conservative but higher return investments?
Yeah, good question. So we take our reserves and we have an investment policy that is part of this fiscal policy. And that investment policy looks at, the first thing is safety, not return on investment. It's really safety that you get the return of your investment. So we're looking at federal treasuries, AAA type of debt that we invest in, or the state local government investment pool as well. They don't provide you the rate of return, but they provide you safety. That's the first piece of our investment policy. The second piece is liquidity, that we are able to take any investment and be able to basically monetize it to a ready cash state. And then the third policy to the investment policy is return. And so we look at our reserves in that fashion. Majority of our investments, our reserves are in the local government investment pool for Oregon. But we do have some out there, investments in bonds, of whether it's a bank or whether it's like Exxon or Chevron, but those AAA rated type of debt issuances of major corporations.
Fred, did you want to show the cash on cash return before debt, service, and capital outlay chart at this point?
If you wanted to show that, I think they have that in their handout.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, basically what we're trying to show is over the years, we break the port down into what we call asset categories, asset centers. And basically there's 5 of them. Our industrial commercial properties is one, our recreational assets, the marina, the airport, and the bridge. And naturally the bridge being the biggest revenue generator, it's also being the biggest cash on cash return before debt. And so basically to get to your cash on cash return, you have your revenues less your expenses. That gets you to an operating expense before the debt and your capital outlay. That's it. Any other questions? I'll then turn it over to John.
All right, well, we have Locke, you actually just posted a question. You want to give that to Fred?
Yeah, question for you, Fred, is are these weighted by value or revenue for averaging?
They're basically, what you project out is just taking your net number, and basically you're deriving what that percentage is based on that.
Okay, and thanks, Fred. That's always appreciated. We are 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which is a good score for this time in the meeting, because the next thing up is key issues. They can be hard to manage, but I'm going to try and hold this to 15 minutes each. And if you have questions, then just as Locke did, if you could post them to the chat board, then we can handle them either now if there's time, or if we run out of time on any given subject, then staff will respond later. Yeah, so in that case, Michael, we got bridge capital planning.
Yes, and this might be one of the issues that could go quicker. You've all seen this before. This is more of, I think, a reminder of where we are with the current bridge capital planning. And of course, the fundamental question that we're all facing, and that you know well, is that the sort of dynamic between what it takes to keep the current bridge safe and operational, and how much we feel we can hold back in the hopes and anticipation that a new bridge will be coming. So this is in effect a reminder that the highlights, though, are in the memo, and I'll just go over them briefly. We have two specific known capital projects or highly likely capital projects to consider. The one that's the most certain is the replacement of the resurfacing of the approach ramps, in particular the north approach ramp. It's the longest one, and it's the one that has the most severe salt penetration in the bridge deck. We've had the testing and analysis done on that. That involved WSP, but I'm sorry, or HDR, but then also Kaufman Engineering as a second opinion. And there's some further work to do, but the hope is that that can be done in a way that's a fairly minimal cost, meaning under $500,000. And it can provide not only the moisture barrier, but a new wearing surface that doesn't exceed the structural capacity of the approach ramp structure, and that also is consistent with the guardrail height. So adding additional layer and what's the clear height remaining to the top of the top of the guardrails. That work is underway. You've issued a, I'm sorry, it's on your agenda today for the regular session, which would be a contract with Kaufman Engineering to proceed with the analysis of that to confirm that their recommended approach is viable and that it can be carried out. The second one, big one, which is less certain but equally important, is the recent weight limit reduction of the bridge. We went from 80,000 to 64,000 pounds. That doesn't impact a lot of traffic, but the traffic that it does impact emanates from businesses on both sides of the river that are shipping heavier loads, logs, fruit to some extent, finished fruit that's going to market, gravel, concrete, commodities like that. And we know we've been limited to 64,000 pounds. The question is, can we get it back up to 80,000 pounds? And part of that is the further structural analysis based on the analysis done by ODOT's engineer, in particular of the north approach ramp structure, but also of a sort of a typical condition, the length of the bridge, which relates to the gusset plates and connecting points on the trusses. It's more detailed than perhaps is needed right now, but there's another element that will come before you, which is a contract amendment to do live load testing of those more typical elements, the length of the bridge, to determine, and our engineer thinks it is highly likely that we can determine that those points actually do not need to be structurally reinforced, but they're adequate already, but we need to prove that through some live load testing. So the point there is that we have additional engineering work to do that will give us a much better idea of if it's feasible to reinforce the bridge and get the weight limit back up, and if so, how much would it cost? And then it ultimately comes down to a cost question, whether that's something that's reasonably, we can afford it, and the benefit to shippers and growers is sufficient to justify that spending. And then there's additional uncertainty related to two items. The in-depth lift span inspections that were to be done last fall were postponed. So this capital plan for the bridge doesn't have the benefit of that testing, which includes non-destructive testing of the various elements, mechanical elements of the lift span, and also another review of the electrical system with the lift span. I only point that out because those inspections are the basis for our forward projections of capital spending, and we rely on those really in-depth analyses to determine if there's a significant further replacement or upgrade needed to keep the lift span operational. Unfortunately, that testing was postponed. It's now scheduled for the end of this month, and the test results will be back to us probably in June by the time they do their analysis. And that is a level of uncertainty about what additional capital spending that may be needed on the lift span. And the other one is the underwater inspections. We've looked at that. We had divers go down. Our engineers have looked at it. We think it's a condition that's been there for a long time and is not, there's no further degradation in the piers at the mud line, but we need to continue to monitor that so it does lend an element of uncertainty. So if you go to the spreadsheet that was in the packet, and please stop me if you have any questions. We're not going to go through this in detail, I promise you, but you can see the vertical red line is more or less where we are today. We're a little bit late on that. But if you look at this under the top rows, which are categorized by approach structures, you can see the two elements of that, the bridge deck overlay. The first is the engineering analysis, and the second is the actual construction of that. It's possible we could move that construction element some, but to be safe, we're placing it in the spring it should say 22 timeframe. And then the other one is the down below under miscellaneous others, the load posting analysis. And you can see that's a straight run of engineering and hopefully into construction. And the idea would be to get that done as soon as possible. So, so again, this is just for illustration purposes. If you can pull out a little bit, Genevieve. And again, if you squint, this is the concept is the important thing here. If you look ahead into 2024 or so, into 25, relatively speaking, there's just a few items that we need to focus on that are important for the current bridge to keep it safe and operational. Once you get into 25, 26, there's an aggregate of projects that start to be either absolutely required or impending. And that's the time frame at which we need to determine whether there's a positive outcome or likely outcome for bridge replacement. Otherwise, we need to really look hard at some serious spending on the existing bridge. So that's the major point here. We're holding back on whatever we isn't absolutely necessary for the next several years. Every year we'll look again and again to make sure, but fundamentally, unless there's traction on a new bridge in the 25, 26 range, we got to look at some serious borrowing and spending on the current bridge. That's that issue. There's any questions? Discussion?
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think that's the overview, that we are delaying spending money on the bridge in anticipation of being successful with bridge replacement. That doesn't work out by 25, 26, we have a different problem. Yeah.
I have a question, if I may, Chair Everett.
Yes.
Michael, do we think that we're going to get the engineering data at the end of April, that work that's being done on the span? Do we think we will get information, cost information, in a timely manner to incorporate it into the 2021 budget or 21-22 budget, or do you think it may require an amendment down the road?
Commissioner, are you referring to the lift span inspections?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think that we won't. It takes a long time, or it takes quite a while to analyze the data that comes back, especially the NDT. So I don't anticipate that, but I think it would be wise for us to keep a reserve. Generally, those, they could be, but I think the best we can do for this budget year is hold a reserve back and allow for some response, some funding to respond to that if needed.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Everett, I see some more questions in chat since we're doing that, I guess.
The first one may have been answered by Michael already, where Mike Fox is asking, Michael, when will the bridge load study be complete? And I think he answered that in the review of the chart.
Yeah, that's
and then-
that's underway now. That's right.
Okay, and then the second question is from Mike Fox, delaying deck fix for another year, what's the impact? Won't it cause further damage to the approach?
Yeah, that's right. I tried to respond by saying or mentioning that that's important. It's not critical, but it's important to get that done in the next year to year and a half. The engineers say the salt degradation is a concern, but it's not serious. But it does mean we need to get the solution resolved and then get that constructed within a year and a half or so.
Okay, over 13 minutes ahead of schedule and we're out of questions. So does anybody else have another one?
I was just getting back to Commissioner Merriweather's issue. We could always, put in the budget that posting rehabilitation in the 21-22 budget, knowing that we may not get to it, until the very end of fiscal 22. But that's something, I'll keep in the back of my mind when I prepare the budget.
Okay, we'll look for that then as the budget comes out. Yeah. And moving on, we're at bridge replacement then. Kevin?
Great. Thank you, President Everett, members of the commission and the budget committee. Thank you for the opportunity to bring this to you this afternoon. As you know, we're getting closer and closer to the end of NEPA. And as we start the phase 2, the post-NEPA phase, with that infusion from the U.S. Department of Transportation build funds, there has been some interest in developing an overarching comprehensive bridge replacement strategy, probably for over a year. In February, we did have a work session to review components of the strategy, really an effort to show the various elements of bridge replacement, incorporating just not only the elected officials, but also project stakeholders and the public. At the end of that, there was a strategic action plan, which developed, I believe, about 9 principles. That was then shared with the bi-state working group in March at their March meeting. And both of those presentations are archived on the Port's YouTube channel. So this is an opportunity to continue to receive feedback. We have received feedback from the bi-state working group. One suggestion that did come from them was to include more specific tasks or goals under each of these various principles or outcomes. And so what is in your packet this afternoon is kind of a streamlined version of that plan down to 7, outcomes. And so really what we are looking for, staff is looking for, is just continue to review this list of outcomes and with ultimately bringing it back to you before the end of June to adopt this strategy plan to really provide staff and consultants direction from the commission moving forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, John, and whatever I can do to help answer any questions you may have, I'm here.
Okay. And I guess I'd ask for questions. Does anybody have any for Kevin?
Kevin, where are we at with the NEPA process?
Right now, we're about 85% of the way through NEPA. We're in the process of finishing up some of the technical reports related to Section 106 And so we're getting feedback from the agencies, which is always really important and critical. From that is a list of mitigation requests. And so we're busy compiling all of those along with all the great ideas that came out through the public comment period. So we are looking at this fall, later on this fall, for the final EIS and the ROD to be published. But the bi-state working group is working on a lot of other elements related to the post-NEPA phasing. And as much as we all love NEPA, I think that there's definitely pent-up demand to put together a good strategy so that staff and consultants have a good feeling moving forward on what we're going to be doing post-NEPA.
Yeah, Kevin.
Mary, I would point out there's been recent significant success with the tribal nations.
Oh, that's great. They're sometimes an outlier.
Wow.
Kevin, once the final is provided and we have a record of decision, how long are the results and the approvals through the NEPA process good? Do we have 5 years to implement the project before we have to reanalyze and reevaluate it, or is there a time limit at all?
You know, there isn't a preordained time limit. You know, there's nothing that says specifically 3 years or 5 years or 18 months. I believe that if we're showing good forward progress on the project, that it will hold up. If for some reason there is a change to the preferred alternative that is laid out in the final EIS, then that would require a reevaluation of the final EIS. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that could always happen as we go through this process. There is an important part of the phase 2 is to have a very robust public process for the aesthetic treatments and some of the other mitigation elements. And so if for some reason during that process, the public requires that there be a change to the preferred alternative, then that would require a reevaluation and some additional work on the NEPA process. But to answer your question specifically, there's not like we got 3 years or some specific time to get the bridge done.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
So we have a couple more questions in the chat box. President Everett, do you want to, I'm not sure where we are in our time. Do you want to do those now or address those?
No, I do want to do it now because we're in good shape for time. And
okay.
Mike, you want to just ask Kevin directly? Thank you for using the chat box. But we have plenty of time. You want to ask your questions?
Sure. There's actually 2 of them closely connected. And Kevin, I know you're getting ready to proceed into this next early phase of design. And how are you planning on doing your contracting for that? Are you going to award a contract for all design, but only release the portion of design that you're going to have funding for? Or are you going to do individual contracts for individual pieces of the design?
It would be the former. So the current scope of work, which is going to be reviewed by the bi-state working group next week, will include full design to 100% with off-ramps at 60%, 30%, DAP, which is design acceptance packet, which is a ODOT milestone, and 15%. And
excellent.
That is done really twofold. One, based upon the tenuous funding, but also based upon what the project delivery model will be. If there's been any, if you actually look in your in those strategic principles, it's really critical, the feedback that we've received, that we really allow for the widest amount of options to be considered through this phase 2 process.
Okay. No, I think that's excellent. And the second question for you, Kevin, if you could bring that back up. Let's see. Yeah, what actions are you taking to attract major funding from the anticipated federal infrastructure bill? You know, the one that's got big bucks in it. How are we going to go get our piece of that?
Great question, and it's really been an all hands on deck. The ports management team has been working with our lobbying folks in not only Washington, D.C., but there's been significant funds already been obligated to Olympia and Salem. And so we are looking at smaller tranches of money in the $5 million range through the COVID funding that came to the states just recently. But really, the big eye on the pie is the Build Back Better proposal that the current administration is putting out. And we are looking and preparing. The details of that plan have not been fully released yet, but it's going to be such a size, if it does pass, that it could be $150 to $200 million ask for this project. Now, we don't know what's going to happen, or if that's going to be a component of the infra or the build programs. And then there's other smaller projects that each congressional district is also going to be basically the return of earmarks, but those will be smaller amounts, and anywhere between most likely in the 5 million for this project. But each congressional district is maxed out at 15 to 20 million.
Let me make a kind of a suggestion to you, Kevin. Think really big. Okay, $100 million is not enough. Go for the whole enchilada. And when you're talking with the legislators and so on, you got to figure out what package do we need to sell this, and encourage you to think about the community involvement, business on both sides. All of the stuff that poor Michael has gotten with this 60,000 pound limit. We ought to somehow get all of those people together and be part of this package that we're going to sell this big number to. Just think big. Don't think 5 million, even 100 million, because 100 million is not going to get your bridge built.
Totally understand. And part of the challenge, Mike, is there's different pots, and trying to make sure that we can be successful with our asks and have a strategic amount that's been developed and considered. And your point's well taken. I mean, we are planning on meeting with and getting letters of support from all of those businesses that have been affected. And that's going to be a major part of any application process, is showing the need and the urgency to get this project done as quickly as possible.
Great. Support it 1,000%.
Okay.
Well, if I could just add that the Biden administration is releasing additional details of the Build Back Better, the large infrastructure bill. And roads and bridges is a relatively small amount of that, $250 billion. Large amount, but relative to almost a $3 trillion ask, it's a relatively small percentage.
We'll take $1 billion.
So what the proposal includes is, as was revealed today, is that there will be a competition for the 10 worst bridges in the country. And clearly we're not going to compete on that level. But then there's another tranche, which is a competitive process, but looking at the 10,000 other worst bridges, smaller bridges in the country. So this is being revealed in bits and pieces, but effectively we'll be in a competitive environment, and we won't be competing at that large urban project, but we will hopefully be highly competitive in that smaller range. So as Kevin said, there will be a very significant effort to pull all the horses together in one direction to put this bridge in the most competitive place when we know more.
Michael, our success at getting national scenic areas included as a percent of infrastructure spending, will that apply to this bill?
No, it won't, or it's unlikely to. And in fact, that carve out, as it were, that success we had was really just to check the box, and it added some value to an application for a infra grant, say. But at this point, I don't think that will help us. It helps politically, especially from a federal standpoint, but so far we don't see any specific added criteria or points for that.
Okay.
Michael, this is Locke. Can I ask a quick question here?
Yes.
Great. Were you tracking recently? The governor's office put out a survey of House member priorities for American Rescue Plan funding. I know that Justin Witham at Anna Williams' office was collating some of those priorities. Did we get a packet in to the governor's office specifying our needs?
We did. Thanks for that. That was a quick turnaround, shall we say?
Really quick.
2.5 days. We submitted 4 projects, and this is based on our lobbyists in Salem. We did submit the $5 million, which we've already vetted with the Joint Transportation Committee, and our representatives are advocating for. But we also submitted 3 more that are non-bridge related, but for other smaller economic development related projects.
I'd love to see what those packages were at some point.
Absolutely. I would just say that the form that they had us fill out effectively had 7 lines for project description, and there were 3 lines for budget. So this was a very quick effort to put something in the mill. And I'll just mention that the other 3, aside from the bridge, were related to Lot 1 infrastructure, primarily transportation infrastructure, the commercial hangar at the airport, and the final one was for the final site development work for the remaining lot at the lower mill. So 3 non-bridge related, but could arguably hit some buttons that are more related to COVID relief and economic recovery in a more immediate time frame.
Thanks, Michael.
I guess if there's not any other questions, are those principles that were in your packet, do those look reasonable, or is there any feedback on those principles?
I think, Kevin, there's another question down in the chat box from Sevia.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay. Considering that there are 2 mainline rail routes running on both sides of this bridge, important federal infrastructure, so may be able to compete due to this factor. I think I couldn't agree more. That's a great point. I think one of the reasons why our build application was so successful is because it's by state in nature, and it will continue to be by state in nature moving forward. That has always been a huge selling point of this project, and the fact that it's in a national scenic area helps as well. So, and the fact that we're already on the US DOT radar will, I believe, and the feedback we're receiving will make our project perhaps more competitive than others that hadn't received other federal programming. So absolutely, we've been working out with the BNSF, keeping them in touch with the program, soliciting letters of support from them when appropriate. And we are really working with them early on to make sure that they're a partner in this project.
All right. And I'm going to close out bridge replacement, move on to port financial trends.
Commissioner Everett, before you move on, I just wanted to point out, and I guess I'm looking for some confirmation that the intent here is to bring something back to the commission before the end of June, hopefully sooner, where there can be a approval for all this strategy would represent as a landing place. These are strategic principles that we think are important and that will carry through for the most part through the project, but we're looking for that that point at which the commission can say, yeah, those represent the key strategic objectives of this project. Each one can have more detail, as you saw during our work session, about what's been done, what are the next milestones, what's the schedule. So it can be more detailed, but fundamentally we want to bring that back for commission approval so that we all are sort of swimming in the same direction and on the same page.
And you're suggesting the strategic action plan is the document you'd like to use to say, get consensus on direction?
It is. So there's a sub question, which is what's the form of that the commission is comfortable with. The strategic principles are a way to organize the strategy but as I said, there's more detail that could be added. But that's what our recommendation is to staff, is that the commission come together after the input from the bi-state working group and reach a fundamental agreement about this is the path we're on at this point.
And we wouldn't reach for that today.
No.
Looks like there is a question regarding item 7, which is the prepare to transition project leadership to another entity.
Yeah, this is Mike. A question for you there, Kevin, is that I would suggest you be very careful with this particular one. If you transition the leadership to somebody else, does that also transfer the existing bridge and the existing tolls coming off of the bridge?
No. It would only be for the new bridge. And the Port of Hood River would continue to retain the existing bridge until really it was removed as part of the construction process.
Yeah, the issue you may have there is that you are getting tolls off the bridge and you're using some of those tolls, I believe, to do some of the work on the new bridge.
Yeah.
So if I was an entity that I was getting this transferred to, I'd say, give me the money with it.
Yeah.
So it's not for you to resolve today, but be a little careful here.
No, that's a good point. There's been questions about using tolls on the new bridge and whether that somehow limits, how the existing tolls can be used. But we can certainly use tolls from the existing bridge on the replacement bridge effort. But the bi-state working group, I believe, understands that there will be a transition, and it's going to be an expensive process to transition from the current bridge to the next. And there's, the phase 3 and phase 4 efforts are going to be very significant from a governance perspective. So absolutely, we all understand how much detail, and it's going to be a very important transition point that we're all cautious about.
Yeah, and it's not just the funding, is the interface issue as well. You're going to have a lot of interfaces between the old and the new bridge as the new bridge is being built.
Absolutely, and that's where we'll get into that next engineering phase and start working on some of those solutions.
Okay, Kevin, I have a related question, and maybe it's better addressed to someone else. But given that we've used the revenues from the bridge to back and stand behind a considerable amount of our debt, what do you foresee happening to that debt in the way it's resolved or paid off or something when that revenue stream begins to be impacted?
I'll let Fred or Michael handle that one.
I'll take a little bit. So Larry, you're thinking of, the existing, we backstop some of our debt just as for some of the non-bridge use. Is that the point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or even for, Fred, even for bridge use, anything that we have that's secured, whether it's for bridge improvements and maintenance or whether it's for other uses. Any financing that we've backed with bridge revenues at the point where that bridge is no longer operating, as you'll be talking about later on, we also have the issue of the outstanding debt, where we may have coverage ratios, or we may have, where does those repayments, that retirement of the debt come from?
Right. So I think the only way to get around that is you're going to have to reissue, sort of pay off the debt, and under the new master declaration, you'll have to put in language that basically allows for the new tolls to pay for the existing debt. That's the only way to sort of get around it, because most debt is sitting out there 20 years, right? 15, 20 years, and this is going to transpire before then. So this next debt issuance will be we may need to have a new master declaration to talk about how we're going to transition the old debt to the new debt. Yeah.
You see that would be a significant part of negotiations with the restructuring of the governance of the bridge.
Possibly. I think they're going to be on two different paths. But when you go into the financing, we'll definitely have to put language in there as if there is this other entity. I don't think we'll know it at that point in time. As you can tell from the CIP list, I mean, we're looking at sort of going out with debt in 2025, 2026. Probably going to happen before this authority finally gets solidified as a real entity. So, but we'll have to think about how we're going to structure that master declaration. Yeah. I don't think the existing declaration will be used at that point.
Sure. Thanks, Fred.
Yeah.
Okay, I have 2 minutes to spare. Thank you so much. Let's move on. Yeah. Port financial trends.
Well, I'm glad Steve Siegel has joined us. Where are you there? There's Steve. So you heard from Steve a couple of years ago, and this is getting back to that sort of existential question that you've just talked about here a little bit, is what happens as you look forward? What's the form of the port? What services can be provided? How do we carry out our responsibilities as a port authority, as a public agency providing services, if in the future 65% or so of the bridge revenue is gone? What does the port look like? And as we've talked about before, and Steve has looked at, the advantage we have is that it's several years away from the point at which there's a new bridge. Therefore, there are some steps that have been implemented and other steps that should be considered and carried out that can, over time, help fill that gap. But this commission and future commissions are going to have to be looking over the hill and sort of continually asking staff and thinking about what form the port takes and how it is financed going forward, and what services it can reasonably provide. So Steve did the last analysis, and thankfully he was willing to look at it again. And partly this is a reminder, and partly this is a further, a little bit more detailed look at what options the commission has now and in the future. So welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Genevieve, can I share my presentation, or are you going to do that, or how's that going to work? I can't. You're
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
I can drive it if you would rather. If you feel confident in your Wi-Fi signal, you could drive it. Either way, whatever you prefer.
All right. Well, I'll say I'm confident. And
okay.
Find out that I'm wrong again.
Okay. So yeah, I'm going to make you a co-host, and you should be able to share your screen.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. Maybe.
I hope I'm sharing the right thing here. Can you see it?
We can see ourselves, so you'll have to just move your Zoom window out of the way of your presentation.
Can you see it now or no? No?
No.
How about now?
Yep, there it is.
Okay.
Okay.
I thought it was great having two screens until I figured out that I got to keep track of what's on which screen at this point. So good afternoon. I'm going to go through a sketch analysis that I did. There's some charts and there's some graphs in here that are really meant to kind of provoke thought and discussion. It's a sketch level analysis, so the actual numbers are conceptual in nature. And what I did is I used the 10-year model that Fred uses for his financial analyses and budgeting, and I just put in some different scenarios to try to kind of frame the issue for you. And so, like Michael said, the last time I did this was, I think, 3 years ago.
Hey, Steve,
Yes.
could you just go full screen with your presentation?
Oh, I'm sorry. How do I do? Yeah. Too small?
No, we're showing the previous slides on the left, so you need to go to start slideshow.
Start.
So if you, under slideshow,
The
at the
top bar, Steve, in the middle, very top.
there you
Right
go. New, start from current slide.
I'm sorry. I am not.
Where it says from beginning to the far left, you could click that where it says from beginning. There you go. There you go.
Thank you. Well, a learning exercise.
We're all in this together.
So evidently it was a real mistake for me to say I wanted to control this, but thank you. So 3 years ago, we kind of took a look at it. And if you think back 3 years ago, we first began to identify this issue that as the new bridge gets developed, the toll revenues won't be available for port functions, general port functions any longer. And what the heck does that mean? And so in this slideshow, what I try to do is a couple of things. I try to kind of go back 3 years and say, okay, what's occurred over the past 3 years? And to what extent have we closed the gap that would be caused by the loss of the toll revenues? And secondly, we also take a look at what additional ideas might be around and what they might do to complete the closing of the gap. The last bullet, again, I just want to emphasize, it's conceptual. It's meant to discuss if there is any particular interest in pursuing any ideas. We would have to go through kind of a much deeper dive than I'm able to provide today. So this first graph goes back, and again, we're looking at the year 2029. Why the year 2029? Probably two reasons. One is that's the first year under the current schedule where we anticipate the new bridge might be open for operations, and therefore toll revenues won't be available. Coincidentally, it happened to be the last year in the model as it was currently formatted, so I didn't project that any further. And I'm using some terminology here that you'll see come up before. The first set of bars where it says bridge dash no new, that means we're looking at 2029. The existing bridge is still operating, kind of the baseline, if you will. No new revenues, meaning all the new revenue initiatives that the port has either implemented or has been implementing over the past 3 years, none of those exist. So this is looking at the problem as we identified it 3 years ago. And what you see for that 2029 scenario are three colored bars. The first one shows the total net income after debt, after capital. And you would see that that would be positive to the tune of about $2.5 million. However, and that shows hopefully just from an operating perspective, whether we're in the black or the red. So here we're in the black, we're up $2.5 million. However, the other thing is that the toll revenues are used to support the general fund activities and cover administrative costs. And that's shown in the orange. So of the positive $2.5 million, I'm sorry, of net income, you could see that not quite, but $1.5 million of that is being used to cover allocated administrative costs. And this gray box is kind of the net of the first two. So what you see there is after accounting for everything, operating revenues, operating cost, debt, capital, administrative allocations, general fund allocations, there's still a positive approximately $1 million in that year 2029. Again, this is with the bridge without any revenues. Now we look at the same thing, but without the bridge. So the last three bars over here says no bridge. So either, well, the replacement bridge is open, there's no toll revenue. And what you see of the remaining functions, the net operating income after debt and capital is already negative. On top of that, if there was money, we would be there'd be some administrative allocation on top of that. And the net result is the last bar over here, which is, I don't know, about $1.7 million negative result for the entire year. So if you compare the first three bars with the second three bars, what you really see is that the loss of the bridge changes the net result in the loss of the toll revenues, changes the net result in the year 2029 from roughly plus $1 million to roughly minus $1.7 million. Going forward, we're going to look at a number of different scenarios, and a good deal of the charts that you're going to see, about 3/4 of the charts you're going to see coming up, really only look at the first three scenarios, and they're all on the same chart. One is the one we just talked about. The bridge remains, no new initiatives, so kind of that line. The other is the other one we just looked at. No bridge, no initiative, no new initiatives. And then finally, no bridge with some new initiatives. So we could start seeing how we're making up that gap. And then towards the end, we're going to look at it with the kind of the new initiatives plus some additional initiatives on top of that. And just to be clear, when we're talking about the kind of the new revenue initiatives or the new revenue, we're looking at some actions that the commission has taken or is in the process of taking, and to generate some additional revenues. And those primarily have consisted of the activities to move the commercial industrial properties towards market rate leases, the additional use of paid parking, and now I guess the planned commercial hangar and whatever revenues that'll generate. So those, when we talk about new revenue, we're looking at those three things, which either have been decided or at least you're in the process of considering. And then, like I said, towards the end, we'll look at some additional added initiatives just to kind of spark some discussion. So just to put it into context, on this chart, we compare all the net new revenue, which is this first bar over here, which is about, I can't remember exactly, about $850,000, if I recall, in 2029. And just to compare that to what the net toll revenue would have been that no longer exists, and that's a number about 2.8. So there's about a $2 million difference between the results of the current revenue generating activities, new generating activities, compared to the net loss from the toll revenues. So this looks at 2029 again, and all it's trying to do is look at operating revenue. So this is not net operating revenue, it is operating revenue before we net anything out. And what I will do is try to go through each of the major subtractions from the operating revenue so you could see what causes the results themselves. So here you can see that in 2029, if the bridge would still have existed, even without any new initiatives, would be upwards to about $11.5 million of operating revenue. That drops to a little over 5 without the bridge, without any new revenues, and gets closer to 6 when we add the revenues in. And you could see just proportionately how large of a contributor the toll revenues are to the overall operating revenue of the port itself. So here we begin to look at, again, 2029, but now we're looking at net operating income. So it's the operating income minus expenses. We haven't taken out any debt or capital outlay or allocated any administrative costs. It's just looking at the operating functions of the port itself. Again, there are the same 3 scenarios. One of them is the bridge without any new revenue, no bridge with no new revenue, and finally without the bridge with the existing new revenue. I'll focus on that part. And what you see is that the bluish color here, the light blue, is the commercial industrial property, the rentals that the port does, and that's showing a pretty positive net operating income, in large part, about half of that, because of the policy that the commission set to begin to raise the rental rates up to market rate. But you can also see there's some negatives here. Of course, the recreation assets are always a negative, give or take $500,000. There's just cost, there's no revenue there. The marina actually here makes a slight positive net operating income, but very slight. And the airport is a negative, but again, very slight. And when we take all that and sum it up, so this is just looking at the total port net operating income before debt, capital, and allocated administrative costs. If the toll bridge still existed, you'd be upwards to above $3 million. but with the without the bridge, but with the new revenues, you're a little bit over $1 million. Again, in 2029. So now we start, what did I do here? 1 second. Let me go here. So if we look at that now after debt service and capital outlay, you begin to see what happens. And again, I'm just going to focus on the no bridge with the new revenues. So this is looking at 2029, but it's looking at 2029 where you would be if the replacement bridge gets built with the existing initiatives. And what you see is after the debt service and capital outlay, there's a bit of positive net operating income, but there's still a fairly large allocation of administrative costs and general fund costs. And the net result is about, what is it, about $1 million negative in total. In other words, you're either eating into reserves or you're going bankrupt. So what that indicated, of course, is that you get now, even though we've done reasonably well generating, creating some new revenue sources equal to a bit over $800,000 in the year 2029, you're still in the negative. So what else can be done to close that gap? And came up with a list, preliminary list. Some ideas are not so bad. Some ideas probably are bad. But they're meant to kind of frame possibilities to, I guess, just generate some thought on your part about how to proceed. And the first idea, for lack of a better term, and I don't particularly like, I call transfer payments. And what I'm talking about here is that even if another entity, a bi-state authority or a compact, is the owner of the replacement bridge, they still need somebody to operate it. It is unlikely, although obviously it's up to other people to decide, but it's probably unlikely that that whatever that entity is would actually create some kind of in-house operations. And what's more likely is that it will be looking to contract with a party, public or private, to provide those operations, to provide the toll operations that the port currently provides. And one, I think, strong possibility, and something that I'm sure will get some discussion, is whether or not that new entity ought to contract with the port for that work. You have the capacity, why not do it? So if that entity were to contract with the port, obviously that entity would pay the costs that the port incurs in doing that work. But part of those costs could include and would include covering off some of the overhead and administrative costs that the port incurs in part by doing the operations, but these would be kind of covering costs that the port would otherwise have to cover without the bridge. And in addition to that, if we were looking at a private model, of course, there'd be a profit margin on top of that. So in looking around, and again, I would consider this conceptual. I wouldn't consider this a detailed analysis. Looking at arrangements that are somewhat similar to this, it looked to me that maybe 15% of the payment that would be made from the by state authority to the port for such operations could be used to offset costs that the port would otherwise have. And in thinking of and in looking at that number, that would be about $400,000 in the year 2029. Another issue we looked at, the port has released a request for information to develop lot 900 or the Barment lot, kind of triangulating on a value of what that ground lease might be should the port decide to pursue in any of the proposals that come in. That might generate a number on the order of 75,000, and I assume that it would grow as a participatory lease at 5% a year. So it'd be about 100 grand in 2029. That says 2019, but it should have said 2029. Another possibility, of course, is that you would cut expenses. Have no particular plan, but I did pick a number. What if we cut 10% as just part of building these scenarios? Another option that we identified was the possibility of a local option levy to fund the recreation assets. Again, not proposing this. This is simply to kind of frame the issue and to give at least an order of magnitude estimate of what it might cost. So a local option levy, of course, is something that you would have to go to the voters for approval. You'd have to do that every 5 years. It's an ad valorem tax. If we used that, if we said, okay, let's use the local option levy to fund the entire deficit from the recreational assets of the port in the year 2029, what would that be? And I estimated that to roughly require about a 17 cent per $1,000 millage rate. And then lastly, an option was identified to me, which was, can we raise rental rates at the airport so that it breaks even, somewhat similar to what's being done, try to get to a market rate, somewhat similar to what's being done on the commercial property. Well, a couple things on that. Built into the model is the notion of the commercial hangar expansion. That does produce a net positive revenue from that expansion, not from the entire airport, of about 50 grand, but it also requires, until the debt is repaid, or roughly a $200,000 a year debt service. And so after kind of thinking about the notion, is there a way where we can realistically try to get the airport to break even? The answer to me seemed to be no, not until the debt is repaid on the hangar expansion, at which time the airport will be not only breaking even, but producing a bit of net income for the rest of the port as well. But that's when the debt is repaid on that, which is 20 years from now. So what we tried to do then is to say, okay, can we package some of these ideas and just kind of see where they get? So I created 2 packages. These are, like I said, not recommended. They're just kind of there to help you think through the scale of the issue and what needs to be done. And the first package consisted of the transfer payment, i.e. port enters into an arrangement with the bi-state compact to operate the new bridge. I included the local option levy we just talked about and the participatory ground lease we just talked about. And package 2 is similar, except I took out the local option levy and I put in cut expenses. And what you see is in 2029, with the new revenues that you're already generating and the additional revenues that would come from that package we just talked about, local option levy and whatever, you wind up just bare. I kind of highlighted it or put a little glow on it because otherwise it would be on the pretty close to the zero line. You are slightly negative, but essentially just at break even after all costs and all expenses, including allocated administration and capital and outlays and debt repayment. And then with package 2, so this is with the cost cutting instead of the local option levy. Again, the net result is pretty close to zero, but actually it's a little above. So those 2 packages, in addition to what you've already done, would kind of get you pretty much to the break-even point where you're paying all your expenses and not having to dip into reserves. Now, obviously, there's additional things that would have to be addressed, which you've already talked about a little bit. You got that coverage issues that would have to be thought about. You got to make sure that you're continuing to fund the reserves, which we haven't fully addressed. But those would be details we'd have to address in a later phase of the study. So with that, I will stop and just see if there's any questions or items you wish to discuss.
Steve, I think there's some in the chat, and I don't know whether to go first or not, but I always like these presentations because they sort of get the juices flowing, you know, at least the ideas. And so one of the things that's out there, you know, for the board to think about, you know, and in the model, we see about $20 million. It's just that about $20 million in reserves come 2029. So the thinking is, you know, some of that's bridge, but some of it's non-bridge. And at that point, it's not federally restricted, right? We don't have a new bridge that basically has this debt that's restricted to this one entity. So the idea would be what? To maybe use some of those reserves for a debt that is non-bridge. For instance, in your presentation, Steve, you have debt for the airport. So we just say, we're just going to not have any debt. We're not going to have a return on that. We're just going to, it's like contributed capital. We're just taking the reserves and just throwing money into our asset centers to basically float the future boat, to float that future cash flow, knowing that, you know, that, yeah, we're taking a ding to our reserves, but the port looks different in 2029. And we basically are getting our asset centers to at least, to be on their own, at least, aviation, at least marina, commercial industrials. We know recreation is a problem. We know that that's probably going to be that would take like a levy or something like that. So, but there's that option that's still probably open. I was just looking at it. I was thinking, no, here's another one that we can think about. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good presentation. I like the ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to. We could spend the rest of the day on this, and thank you, Steve. Actually, I think it's hopeful that it shows that there's a path to survival, although lots of devil in details left. But this time we're 15 minutes over, unless somebody has a compelling question.
Do we have any in the chat room?
I don't see any.
Svea had a question about the use of the tourism money. I tried to answer in the chat. And then Svea, you had a comment about the levy to fund recreation falling short. And by that, you mean the votes falling short for approval, right?
Yeah, that was just sort of my opinion, that we're gonna have a hard time getting a levy passed in town where people are gonna wanna fund people coming here to play. They're gonna say, these are out of town people and we're supposed to fund their recreation. That might be a hard sell, so somehow we have to extract those funds from the places that are profiting the most.
Yeah, and I want to be clear just to make sure that there's not a story that comes out and says levy proposed. What we're trying to do here is just kind of say, look, here's, it may be a really bad idea that should be rejected, but just to kind of lay out an inventory of ideas to get everybody thinking about it.
Yeah. So just to be clear there, Genevieve, and it's just something I think about every now and then when I see how much money the chamber gets from different things, construction. And again, I haven't looked at it in great detail, but I think, do we really need to promote people coming here? They just seem to come. So where is all that money going?
Yeah, that's the perennial question. And transient room tax by state statute is almost exclusively to be used for marketing. It's kind of a cannibalistic fund that feeds itself, it's primarily for marketing. Although the local taxing entities, which in our case is the city and the county, they can use some of that money for campgrounds and parks, which the county opted to do a few years ago. They completely pulled out of the agreement with the chamber. So none of their money goes to marketing anymore. It's all for, I think, Tollbridge Park and Tucker Park mainly is what it's directed to. The city still pays into the marketing fund, but they also retain, I think, 25% of the total, and that can go into the city's just general fund for police and whatnot. Okay. So it is really restricted because of COVID. Travel Oregon, the state agency that sort of oversees all of that, they're now on their second round of grants, and they're making grants for capital improvements, which they almost never ever fund. It's almost all exclusively marketing. But this is, obviously a very special case in response to the pandemic.
Yeah, and if it seems like if we can get any of that capital improvement money to get ahead of the game, with infrastructure, with port recreation infrastructure, that would be helpful now. So we don't have to try to come up with it in the end, but I'm sure you're on that. But
yeah, we were one of, what I know, we were one of 6 different applicants from Hood River that I know of.
Wow.
So lots of folks going after those significant amounts of new money that haven't been there in the past, and you don't want to miss the bus. So yeah, we're on that.
Yeah, but yes, I agree that it's time to start thinking of how we can fund recreation.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
If I could, Commissioner Everett, just add that this is obviously an ongoing, continual, annual process of looking at what steps we can take that put in action that will have a positive impact over time. It has a relevance to near term to the extent that the commission will be looking at interest from developers or businesses, for example, on the Barman property, and to what extent that notion of utilizing that property to produce ongoing revenue is important. And it will impact the commission's decisions and evaluation of the commercial hangar. So there's some near-term actions that are in place or will be in place in the budget that will have an impact on this larger thought process about where we're going. And staff will point those out, and we will remind you of these opportunities for revenue enhancement or the consequences of spending and how that impacts the longer term revenue picture for the port.
Yes, understood. And with that, I am going to move on to staff organization roles and responsibilities.
Well, that's me again, and this could be pretty quick. It's sort of like, this was a hard memo to write. It's like looking in the mirror. and looking around at our office and seeing the future, or trying to anticipate the future. It's pretty self-explanatory. We have some fundamental challenges, I guess you'd say, or dynamics that we're facing. We have senior staff. There's several of the senior staff that will likely be looking at retirement, and the port needs to prepare for that transition. And we do a really broad range of activities here, and there are certain that are very specialized, especially related to the tolling. So what this is trying to do is anticipate what changes we can make in the roles and responsibilities and the makeup of the staff that allows for a smooth transition when that transition occurs in the next few years or shorter. And so we draw upon the skills and experience of the staff we have, which is very, very significant and valuable. And we try to think about ways in which we can utilize the staff we have and maximize the benefit, but also be mindful of the really significant workload that's been pressing on us for seems like several years and hasn't really changed. So we have to be mindful of staff. We have to look to the future. So there's other issues to solve for here. But fundamentally, what I'm considering proposing, shall we say, in this fiscal year budget is some changes in how we do the work around here. The most important one, or one of the most important, is the creation of the role of a deputy director. In the likelihood that I get hit by a bus, and we're not talking people here, we're talking positions, but in this case, I'll say, if I get hit by a bus, what would the port do? How would the port manage that? I'm probably the easiest one to solve for, honestly, if I step on the wrong rock or something. But it is important to anticipate that change and making sure that there's someone here that has the breadth of knowledge and the understanding of the operational side and the relationship side to keep it going while there's either that role is filled by the deputy or there's a recruitment process. Second, as I've described in the memo, one of the challenges we have here is that some years we have really significant capital spending, really significant burden on the construction administration side, contracting, and the closeout of projects. And other years we have it's still a material, but not so significant. And so the role of an administrative assistant or a new position that would allow that support system across different sectors of the port in contract management agreements, in the administrative side of things can be a great help, and something that would be needed to support and valuable to support different positions. On the finance side, honestly, as a category, this is the hardest to solve for. And I will say that the CFO that you have is one that has unique and really significant skill sets in terms of tolling management, the interface between tolling and the financial systems of the port. There's risk in these categories to make sure there's no security breaches. There's technical issues that prop up all the time. We have a really good consultant network that supports us, and they have 24-hour access to their skills. But we just, being realistic, we have to look at the future transition of a variety of positions, including that one. So this is one that's the hardest to solve for, but we have excellent staff that has great growth potential. Potentially that we could conceive of, not now, but relatively soon, of a sort of assistant finance manager that can step further into that role and begin to understand more about our financial systems, especially the relationship with the management of toll staff and the tolling systems overall. The next one is laid out here, but our facilities manager does a really wide range of things. I think it's more for efficiency purposes and for the throughput of our projects. especially on the capital side, it would be advantageous to provide more of a center of gravity for the capital projects. And our current facilities manager has really extensive skills in contracting, contract management and such. And then that would mean, as a corollary, that what in an old-fashioned way is called the lead man, I apologize, that's just what's been called, that there would be essentially a designated assistant that would manage the day-to-day work of the crews, scheduling, making sure that tasks are completed adequately and things like that. And then finally, if those steps take place, then it really does call for a new position, an entry-level facilities employee that can step in as our staff is getting older, and as you get older, you're subject to various medical conditions. And so those are the main themes that I've been considering. You can see the key issues I've mentioned there. Clearly, adding staff is counter to the long-range challenge of replacement funding for the bridge, but I don't see a way to get from here to there without at least a couple of new positions and recategorization of some existing ones. So those are the issues that I wanted to bring to your attention. And I think for this, I would appreciate feedback on the direction this is going. This isn't set in any way. I want to prepare and present a sort of organizational chart that graphically portrays these changes to you. But the intent would be, based on feedback here, to build in all or some of these elements into the proposed budget that you'll consider in next month. So I'm open for any questions or any initial feedback you've got.
Michael, I'm encouraged and I commend you. This has been a long time coming. It's great to see the planning. If we have to spend money now to make us stronger in 2029, I'm in favor. But I don't think we're going to get any depth into this subject today. I'd like to bring it up again in future meeting. Yeah.
Okay.
We are behind schedule. Nobody has any pressing questions?
No, I'll agree with you there, Commissioner Everett. There's no need to get into depth on this today at all, but I completely agree with this and support. I want to see some more in the future, Michael, and we've already talked about this a little bit. I support this, and it's something I'm glad you're thinking about now and not after the fact. So definitely a good plan.
Okay, well, you will see in the proposed budget some implications from some, like I said, some or all of these steps for your consideration later.
Okay, and Genevieve, the strategic business plan update.
Yeah, this is just an update, so it'll be real quick. And most of you are already aware of where we're at right now. We've been underway with the development of our 2021 to 2026 strategic business plan since November of 2019. In March of 2020, that effort halted due to the pandemic. Last fall, we restarted that effort and made some clarifications on actions going forward. And we're now getting ready to deliver to the commission later this month, staff recommended outline and rough first draft. We, since 2019, have held several focused work sessions on really big issues. And so we're really not that far behind in terms of gathering commission direction and consensus on some large strategic issues. We've had multiple bridge replacement strategy work sessions. We recently had an airport operation work session, but there's more to discuss there. And we did finalize the lease strategy that has been noted a couple of times during this meeting, and our real estate development prioritization meeting was also really informative. All of those are not wasted efforts in the context of the strategic business plan, and we're in the process right now of porting basically all of those decisions that you have made into the new document for review. We do have some staff recommendations for some port operations that are not as fully baked out as those I just mentioned. We think we may want to schedule a special work session to discuss airport strategies, tasks, and capital improvements for inclusion in the plan. We also think it might be helpful to schedule a special work session focused on the marina and waterfront recreation. Staff plans to have for your review a preliminary list of capital improvement projects. You may remember the first impetus really for the development of Business Oregon's mandate to all ports in Oregon that they all develop and get approval of their strategic business plan was they wanted to make ports really think through all of their capital planning and have all of their projects for their 5-year, 6-year plans on a list included in their development, their strategic business plan. And that would determine eligibility for state grant funding. And so that's really the purpose of the list. Anything that we think we may apply for grant funding for, we want to have on that list. And so we'll have that list, a preliminary list of projects for you to review. And as we go forward toward the end of June, which is when the plan should be published, we'll have that a more finalized list. And then finally in mid-June, we would want to schedule an open house to collect public input on the final draft or the final draft before we go to the final document itself. So that's really just an update on the project. Any questions at this point, or?
Just one, Genevieve, are those, have those projects also been submitted to the SEDS process listing? The potential capital project?
Yeah, so as you all are aware, the SEDS process is underway right now, and each of the counties, all of the entities in the counties come together to identify capital projects and do some sort of local prioritization of those projects. And those are then included in the comprehensive economic development strategy that's compiled by MCED, primarily for the same reason. If you want to get federal funding from the Economic Development Agency, for example, sometimes it's mandatory that your project be listed on a SEDS document. And so that's the purpose of, one of the main purposes of that effort. Our list is generally more comprehensive to where it's really down to new asphalt on a parking lot, which is something that we would not include in the SEDS document, but we certainly want to have it in our plan.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Genevieve. Then Anchor Way Extension Project, Michael.
So this is the last issue, and it's in part a reminder of where we're at and partly a look ahead. Genevieve, if you can pull up the first graphic. And we've talked about Anchorway before, so I'm not going to go into the detail, but we just as a reminder, Lot 1, this comes out of the public infrastructure plan for Lot 1. The east-west street that's bisects the site is Anchorway or East Anchorway. That's a key connector from Second over to First, and it's an important transportation infrastructure project from the standpoint of the interchange access management plan, which allows for a right-in, right-out configuration around the interchange. Essentially, it's an alternative route around from Riverside Drive and Second. So that Anchor Way portion, we've proceeded with a small contract for conceptual engineering for that. That work is done. The cost estimate that came along with that, thankfully, essentially corroborated the infrastructure plan estimate, about 1.57 million. That project is one that the commission has identified to, at least preliminarily, to move forward on, because it's a key component piece of not only reorganizing the utility infrastructure on Lot 1, essentially relocating 3 different utility lines that travel south of there and relocating them in Anchor Way, but also becomes the organizing principle around the future development of Lot 1. So now that we have a pretty solid cost estimate and concept engineering, we have an intake process that's underway with ODOT for immediate opportunity grant. And that is, it looks like it might go higher, but somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 that's I'm fairly optimistic about. And then second, we've initiated we've made the initial contact with the Economic Development Administration for what could be a $500,000 grant for that. And so the question that would be embedded in the proposed budget would be to, if we're looking at some good possibilities of grant match, do we move forward on the further engineering of that street in order to complete the plans and specs and plan for construction possibly in fall of 2022, or even some elements in spring. So that's a check-in with the commission. Want to make sure that we're still looking at continuing to develop that project and prepare it or get ready for the possibility of a significant grant. And then the second is, it's more of a, I guess you'd say a long shot, but because there is a significant amount of grant funding opportunities that appear to be out there, not only at the federal level through the reemergence of what are called community-directed projects, or used to be known as earmarks, where senators and representatives can literally allocate some funds to a specific project, but also more recently, and we talked about it earlier, through the state, because the state's receiving somewhere almost close to $3 billion for COVID relief and economic recovery. And so of the several projects we proposed through our Representative Williams and Senator Thompson included Anchor Way, but we also put in North First Street. And North First Street is the sort of long shot element, but there are opportunities out there that could bring significantly more assistance from the state, potentially for the feds, in order to not only relocate Anchor Way, but First Street. I don't want to fool you. It's unlikely, but it was an approximate opportunity to put the request in, get it on the map, and see if there's traction from the state side, especially. And if that were possible, it would mean potentially doing both Anchor Way and First Street, probably in phases, but near simultaneous, which would significantly establish the infrastructure for not only Lot 1, but also to create more park space along the Nichols Basin edge. And as pointed out in those small boxes there, and it is in the waterfront refinement plan, to allow for a modicum of single-story retail buildings along the waterfront. All that intended to increase the pedestrian attractiveness and viability and activity of that edge of the waterfront. So this is mostly a look ahead. The idea would be to, because I'm feeling that we really do have some real possibilities for Anchor Way, to continue that effort. And then First Street is more of a informational, to let you know that we did prop that up. And there is some, although modest, possibility that there could be some funding accruing to that project as well. The challenge here, of course, is that there's no immediate return on this investment. It's not like building a building, but my recommendation is the port continue to consider Anchor Way, not only because of the significant interest in grant funding, but because it's a really significant organizing piece of infrastructure for the future sale or lease or collaborative development process for Lot 1. I think that's really it. There's a cost estimate attached here, and maybe you can just quickly show Genevieve where we are with the engineering. There's the more detailed cost estimate, and then this is the developed plan set for Anchor Way. That's fine. Just it gives you an idea of where we are in that engineering process. Just quickly, that first section below the plan, in the plan view, is approximately where those utilities cross. So this Anchor Way would relocate those utilities into what could be a future right-of-way corridor. And then the north-south curb cuts are what would be the beginning of the swerve, if you remember that concept, that is the organizing principle for access, the north-south pedestrian throughway, and also for stormwater retention and detention. The only other thing I'd point out is in the upper right, you can see a different configuration of the curb, and that's because that's a carve out or a placeholder for a transit location. So you see a small rectangle, which would be a bus shelter, potentially expanding in the future, and the curb radii and the curb length at that upper left or northeast quadrant are to accommodate buses pulling in and unloading passengers.
And Michael, sorry.
No, that was it. Go ahead.
There are a couple of questions in chat. If you can manage those in 3 minutes, we're on schedule.
Oh, pressure. What are they? Let me pull them up here.
Well, Mike asked what businesses we're targeting with this expenditure. In my view, we're getting shovel-ready dirt, unless you have a specific business in mind.
Yeah, it's a key question. It's light industrial zoning. There's an overlay for a modicum of commercial based on a limited building by building basis. So fundamentally, it's a fundamental challenge. What's the business that's appropriate for the waterfront, that can accommodate intense or significant design standards, and can be built and constructed in a way that has a lot of curb appeal and pedestrian interface. So we're really looking at a market suite that's fairly typical of what we've seen before. This is a place where the light industrial zone does allow some forms of commercial businesses or manufacturing businesses that might manufacture overseas, but they need a headquarters for their office and R&D and marketing and things like that. To some extent, the recreational business is a target, and to some extent, like I said, the office slash headquarters type businesses are a target as well.
And then Svea offered that, was there any opportunity to use rent lot 1 as a laydown area for bridge construction and make some money doing that?
Yeah, that would be counter to the notion of preparing the site for development, because the bridge construction process would be several years long. And I believe they would probably want to be as proximate as possible to their construction site instead of on and off the freeway. But that's going to be a key challenge for that contractor. Where do you lay down and where do you store? I think it's probably better to look at lot 1 because it is highly used when there's a closure of the bridge for trucks to pull off, and that can be it's a very valuable resource for that. It also serves as parking and for Harvest Fest and for days during the summer when there's a lot of parking demand.
Okay. We are exactly on time. Yeah. And in that case, in our schedule, we have a 10-minute break. But I'd like to just, that was a lot of ground to cover in 90 minutes. So does anybody have any wrap-up comments, or particularly from the Budget Committee? In that case, let's take a 10-minute break. Reconvene at 3:35. for the 10-year financial planning model. Always fascinating.
All right.